Bands reunited. I was involved in a long overdue maintenance day at Big Top when the phone rang. I pick up and the woman on the other end tells me she works for a record company and that she got my number from a friend. She wanted to come to my studio and check it out with a view to booking a band in to do some recording. I was not really hiring out the studio because it was usually too much grief, but if it was for a record company then I could get full price and at least the musicians would be of a certain calibre and recording them wouldn't be such a chore. Ideally, they'd bring their own engineer and I could make the tea all day. I'd done a couple of sessions with professional bands, but working with some of the amateur bands was tiresome. I had another level in for a few days, but I was making tea, which suited me. I'd also recorded a live album with the Popes and did a load of overdubs and repairing back at the studio, but overall I wasn't enamoured with the idea of being an engineer. That said, if someone were paying me top money then I'd do it, so I gave the woman on the phone the address and agreed to meet later that day. I was actually stuck behind a rack of gear when the buzzer on the intercom went. I was dressed in my work clobber and looked like a scruff, but who cares? She'd be in and out in 5 minutes and I could crack on. My studio has an entrance on the street and you walk through a little alley under a building to reach my building at the back. I buzzed the woman in and walked outside to greet her walking in. I looked down the alley and see about 15 people walking up with microphones and about 3 cameras. I have to say my initial thought was that Holly had died and a news crew had been sent to get me reaction. Why else would a film crew be turning up at my door? Leading the pack was a man who tells me he's from VH1 in America. They're doing a show called Bands Reunited, and would they be able to ask me some questions? What could I say? Well, I suppose I could have said go fuck yourself and ushered them out onto the street, but that would have seemed a little rude, so I invited them in to hear them out. He showed me a copy of the Pleasure Dome sleeve that had Mark's signature on it. Amir, the host, informs me they've already spoken to Mark and that the others would follow. How come Mark hadn't told me? We go into the live room and I make a dozen cups of tea and coffee whilst they set up their equipment. We sit down and the interview begins. It's the same as hundreds before with pretty much the same questions, except this has the added twist of trying to reunite Frankie. I'm asked if I'd like to meet up with the other guys in the band and I agree. However, I have no desire to play live. I was still in touch with Mark and Ped. I'd last seen Mark when I took the wife and kids to Disneyland, Florida. He'd come to visit us with Laura and his son Cairo. Ped had helped me with some web stuff, so I'd seen him recently, so reuniting with them was no big deal. I hadn't seen Holly since the day we went to support him in court, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen Paul. When asked if I wanted to meet up with the others, I had no objections, and if they were up for it, then so was I. So began the VH1 circus. They flew Paul in from New Zealand and flew Mark in from America, and a meet was arranged at the Depot rehearsal studio in Holloway. I'm collected in a nice black Jag and drive down there, but when we arrived the driver's instructed to drive around the block as one of the other guys was arriving at the same time. I go to a cafe and grab a cup of tea and wait to be summoned. I turn up and cameras are stuck in my face and I'm ushered to a part of the building and informed that everyone's here. The whole thing has an air of military secrecy about it, and one by one we're ushered downstairs to a studio with a row of chairs waiting to be filled by former band members. I think I was second or third in, but the first 3 were Mark, Ped and I. Paul turns up next and hugs and handshakes are exchanged, and not long after Holly comes in with his dog Funky. When the show was aired, they made it look like Holly had kept us hanging around and we were anxious as to whether he would show, but in reality he turned up minutes after Paul. The power of the edit, eh? It's all very cool and good-natured, and I was genuinely pleased to see everyone again. Everyone was a little on guard as we were all wearing microphones and had cameras pointing at us. It was odd to have such a personal moment watched with such scrutiny by strangers. I can't speak for the others, but I felt I couldn't really be myself. Everyone's all smiles, but with an air of caution. I'd visited Holly years before, and I had no axe to grind with him. I'd never fallen out with Paul, so he was cool, and Mark and Ped were my mates anyway, so there was no bad feeling in the air. The interview starts and we're asked about our emotions in reuniting in this manner. The demise of the band comes up and led to Mark apologising for the arse-kicking incident at Wembley. Eventually the host broaches the idea of playing together at the Scala in King's Cross in a few days' time. Collectively we're evasive, ending the interview with a promise to discuss it off camera. Personally, I had no intention of playing with these guys. My reasons? Well, first off, The only trump card, or value, we had as a band would be reuniting to play, and I was not prepared to do that on VH1's terms. As Holly said in the interview, we weren't wedding singers, and as far as I was concerned, there was no way I was playing for these bunch of jokers, let alone for free. Why should I? We all leave the depot and agreed to discuss the idea further over the phone in the next day or two, but my mind was made up immediately. I wasn't keen on stepping back into the band hierarchy that existed a few years previously. Since I'd been performing solo, I'd grown as a musician and songwriter, and I had no desire to take what I saw was a bit of a backward step. I was the last one in, and had always felt that I had the least say in the band. Mark thought it was his show, and I wasn't going to be told what to do by someone who, in my opinion, had stepped out the music business years ago. Maybe it wouldn't have worked out like that, but I didn't fancy taking a chance and getting involved in something I might regret. I also thought that if I jumped aboard, it would mean all the work I'd done trying to promote my own music would have been a waste of time. I felt the band had enjoyed its time in the limelight, and I didn't want to go back. Holly didn't want to do it either. I was so desperate not to be involved that when the time was arranged for us to reconvene at the Scala, I told them I had to work in the studio and I couldn't turn down paying customers to spend the day playing all our yesterdays for free. When the day arrived, only Paul, Mark and Ped showed at the Scala. When interviewed for the show, they explained that Holly was not keen, but covered for me by saying that I was, but couldn't be there on the day. I think they saw this as doing me a favour, but I wouldn't have been concerned if they'd painted me as the party pooper. It turned out Holly was going to be the bad guy, and the final editor of the show painted him in that light, which I believe was very unfair. Holly didn't want to know, but I was probably as adamant, if not more so than him, not to toe the line. A night out was arranged without Holly for the following night. I was travelling early morning to go to the match, so I used it as my excuse not to meet up. In truth, I actually drove up on the Friday night to make sure I distanced myself further from the farce. Looking back, I'm not sure why I was so reluctant to hang out with the guys. The reunion hadn't been unpleasant, but the atmosphere was a little odd, and I didn't really enjoy it, and I saw a night out as an extension of that. I wasn't sure if Reformation talk was on the agenda, and I didn't want to get into that. VH1 had failed in their mission, but that night out probably saw a seed planted in the heads of the other three, and this had become apparent a few months later. Mark spent a few days in Liverpool, and when he headed south to catch us playing home, I picked him up at the station and we headed up to my studio and met up with Ped for a beer in Barnet. I took them to the Mitre, a very old local pub, so Mark could snap some footage on his camcorder. I don't think there's a building in America that's older than the Mitre, so it'd be something to show the folks back home. We have a few beers and a good laugh, and although I have nothing against Paul, I felt more comfortable with just the three of us. We finished the night with a curry, Mark stayed over at ours, and I drove him to the airport early next morning. About 3 weeks after the show was aired, I get a delivery of a large parcel from America. It's a framed photograph of our reunion moment with a couple of smaller backstage shots. The main photograph was okay, but the other two were shit. I wouldn't have hung it in my house. Included were a letter of thanks and a couple of t-shirts and a DVD of the show. What a great deal. They get a free programme about one of the biggest bands in the 80s to syndicate around the world for profit, and I get a framed picture and a t-shirt. Still, I guess it was a decent gesture. My mood changed 2 weeks later when I got a bill for 17 quid for the import duty on the picture I didn't even want. The item had been posted from a business address and therefore duty was owed, but I wasn't paying it. Why should I? Okay, it was only 17 quid, but why should I pay for a gift? Least of all a gift I didn't like or want. I rang VH1 a couple of times and mailed them but got nowhere. 2 more weeks pass and the £17 debt is up to 47 quid because it's been handed on to a debt collection agency that have added their fee. If I didn't pay within 7 days, then it would escalate to 80 quid. I'm very pissed off. Reluctantly, I pay it and decide I'll write my version of the whole story on the reverse of the picture and list it on eBay with a £47 reserve. I sold it a week later for 120 quid, and that was where my association with VH1 ended. Paul, Mark and Ped would cross their radar again a few months down the line. At the end of summer 2004, I get a phone call from Mark telling me that Trevor Horn's been in touch about us reforming to do a gig at Wembley in aid of the Prince's Trust. The show was to celebrate Trevor's 25 years in the music business and would feature lots of bands that had worked with him throughout that time. Yes, Seal, the Pet Shop Boys and ABC were confirmed, and Frankie were pending. Mark tried in vain to convince me, but I wasn't biting. First, I've got no time for the royal family, and secondly, why would I want to help out Trevor on? We were still tied to the shitty deal and they were still making fortunes out of us, and as far as I was aware, there'd be no payment because all of it was for charity. The last ZTT release had been the appallingly titled Hard on DVD. This was basically all the Frankie videos and a bunch of interviews. The only member of the band featured was Paul because he was still on friendly terms with some of the people at ZTT. The release was a piece of shit, with everyone seemingly taking their slice of credit for the Frankie phenomena. As always, we'd paid for it. I seem to remember seeing an invoice for about 70 grand for transferring the videos from analog to digital. How many DVDs would we have to sell at our shitty royalty rate before we recouped that expense? I actually bought my copy and was pretty disgusted. How could they release this without the majority of the band's consent and without the majority of the band contributing? Of course, there were plenty of hardcore Frankie fans that would rush out to buy this cinematic gem, thus ensuring ringing tills at ZTT. This was the last straw as far as I was concerned. I was pretty stunned that the others were keen to get on the dance floor and take the devil's hand again in light of the history between the band and the label. I guess they had the reasons. I gave them my blessing and told them I had no objections to them doing it under the Frankie name. Jed was recruited to take my place, but they had nobody to replace Holly, and this is where VH1 stepped in again. They decided to film a band's Reunited 2 featuring Frankie's search for a new singer. It covers the auditions for the new singer, the recruitment of the new singer, and the rehearsals building up to the big event. When I watched it, I couldn't believe what I saw. Mark and Paul seated at a table with Jill Sinclair. How could they get back into bed with these people and come across as best buddies for the camera? I was shocked and cringing a little as I watched, but I wasn't arsed. It was their life, their choice, and good luck to them. Holly was not so generous. I think he was very pissed off that the band used the Frankie name for the gig, and doubly pissed off that they were in cahoots with ZTT. The only thing that upset me slightly was some of the press about the show, saying that 4 of the original members of the band were performing. Okay, technically Jed was an original member of the band, but in most people's opinion there were only 3. It seemed like a ploy to make the Reformation a little bit more credible. One of the guys on the Frankie boards, the recently departed Steve Irvin, messaged me and suggested that I should do a gig on the same day in the same area so that the assembled Frankie fans could catch a bit of my music as well. I drove to Wembley and went into a small Irish pub called the Crock of Gold and spoke to the landlord. I asked him if I could turn up on the day of the Prince's Trust gig and do a show at 6 p.m. before the doors opened at Wembley. I assured him there'd be a few punters in and he agreed. There was no fee involved, so it was a no-brainer for him. Niall was away, but I managed to get Tony Kiley to cover the drum stool and we turned up to play. The pub was quite small and we set up our equipment in front of the dartboard. The performance space was so small that Dan's bass was partially covering the door to the toilets. That meant every time someone wanted a leak, he had to lift his bass up like a drawbridge. We played for about an hour, and for some of the Frankie fans, it was their first exposure to me music. They loved it and loved the intimacy of the gig. They were sitting 2 feet in front of me and getting right into it. I sold a few albums and signed a few Frankie sleeves, and the evening was a success. When the Wembley gig was announced, I decided I wanted to go and see the guys play. Even though I wasn't involved, I wanted to see Frankie play live for the first time since I'd seen him play at Pickwick's all those years ago. Okay, it wasn't all of Frankie, but I still wanted to go. I could have got a ticket from Ped, but I didn't want to go and be with all the band's other guests. I wanted to be a bit incognito and just sit and watch as a fan like the rest of the audience. I asked my mate Adrian Bushby to get a couple for me, so I presumed I'd be mingling with strangers on the night. I had 2 tickets and decided to ask a Frankie fan to accompany me to the gig. A guy called Dave Rutter had offered to get me a ticket, so when I got my pair I asked him if he wanted to go with me. He was chuffed, so after the early evening gig we headed over to the arena. We took our seats. Brilliant plot. Right next to the aisle with a bar just yards from the exit. I sat in my seat and looked round to survey the crowd. Sitting in the seat right behind me is Ped's dad, Ray. So much for me being incognito. The gig starts, but it's pretty lame. I've no interest in the artist performing and I've only come to see the lads. Unfortunately for me, they're last on the bill. Apparently ticket sales had shot up when it was announced that Frankie were playing, so they were rightly moved to top billing. That would account for the audience's apparent disinterest in the show. They were there to see Frankie just like me. Seal comes on and the crowd amp it up a little. He definitely gets them on their feet and he leaves the stage to a great reception. Frankie come on stage and the crowd all get to their feet, including me. I can't remember the order of the songs or much about the gig in detail, but it was great. 2 Tribes being played with a full orchestra was pretty epic. Watching on, I'll admit to being a little green-eyed, but I was more proud than anything else. The lads had stuck their neck out and won. Ryan Malloy did a great job filling Holly's shoes, and I was pleased that Frankie had conquered Wembley nearly 20 years on from their last appearance. I was wondering what me and the boys would have sounded like performing on that big stage. We'd done quite a few gigs in the previous couple of years, and we were tight. Even though there were often months between gigs, I knew the guys could always turn in a minimum 8 out of 10 performance. Most gigs were a 9 or a maximum. I finally had a consistent lineup of musicians and I loved playing with them. We performed at a festival in Eastleigh near Southampton and had the big stage, the big PA and the big crowd and went down extremely well, but the majority of gigs were for little or no payment. I loved playing with the guys so much that I didn't mind being out of pocket. I wanted everyone to hear this epic noise we made, but the mechanics of doing it without a promoter were difficult. The Wembley show had given the lads a taste of fame again, and they were keen to carry on and try and secure more shows with this current version of Frankie. I had no interest in turning the clock back, but I had no objections to them doing it. Holly didn't feel the same way.